The maid's toddler sat on the billionaire's fiancée's seat in the office. The room fell silent. "Mama, why is that lady so mean?" The question came out in a whisper, soft, innocent, and devastating in the way that only a 3-year-old's words can be. Emma tugged at the hem of her mother's uniform, her round brown eyes wide and searching, her tiny brow furrowed with the kind of confusion that belongs only to children who haven't yet learned that the world isn't fair. Sofia Reyes felt her heart crack clean down the middle. She knelt quickly, pressing her lips to her daughter's forehead, trying to shield the little girl from the stares of the 12 people sitting around the long mahogany conference table. 12 executives in tailored suits. 12 people who had just watched Vanessa Hartwell, the fiancée of billionaire Adrian Cole, the most powerful man in the building, point a manicured finger at Sofia and laugh. "She's not mean, baby," Sofia whispered, her voice barely holding together. "She's just having a bad day." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew Emma didn't believe them. Because Emma was 3 years old, and 3-year-olds are the most honest creatures on the planet. They feel everything without filters. They see everything without pretense. And what Emma had seen, what the entire room had seen, was Vanessa Hartwell standing at the head of the conference table, her designer dress perfectly pressed, her diamond ring catching the light, pointing at Sofia, like she was something stuck to the bottom of a shoe. It had started so simply. Sofia had been asked, specifically requested, to bring fresh coffee and the morning file folders to the executive conference room on the 32nd floor. It was a Friday, which was the day her regular babysitter, old Mrs. Patterson from apartment 4B, had her dialysis appointments. There was nobody else. Sofia had no family in the city. She had no backup plan. She had only Emma and she had only this job, and losing either one was not something she could afford. So she dressed Emma in her nicest little outfit, a white dress with tiny yellow sunflowers that Sofia had found at a thrift store for $3, pulled her curly dark hair into 2 small pigtails, and whispered the rules on the elevator ride up. "Stay close to Mama. Don't touch anything. Use your inside voice. Be good." Emma had nodded with the gravity of a tiny diplomat. "I be good, Mama. Promise." And she had been. She had stood quietly at Sofia's side, one small hand wrapped around 2 of her mother's fingers, while Sofia set the coffee tray down and began arranging the folders. The executives had barely noticed them. This was how it always worked. The help became invisible when the powerful people needed to focus. But then Vanessa had walked in. Vanessa Hartwell did not make quiet entrances. She arrived like weather, the kind that changes the entire atmosphere of a room before a single drop of rain falls. She was stunning in the way that expensive things often are, all sharp edges and glossy surfaces, her dark hair swept into a perfect chignon, her perfume arriving 3 steps before she did. She was the woman Adrian Cole had been engaged to for 8 months. She was the woman who, according to office gossip, had already begun redecorating his penthouse apartment and firing members of his household staff she deemed aesthetically unsuitable. Sofia had kept her eyes down. She'd learned early that the best strategy with Vanessa was invisibility. But Emma, bless her heart, had looked up. And Emma had smiled. It was the smile she gave everyone. Wide, gap-toothed, completely unguarded. The kind of smile that made strangers stop on the sidewalk and press their hands to their chests. Emma had smiled at Vanessa Hartwell the way she smiled at butterflies and puppies and the nice man at the corner bodega who always slipped her a lollipop. Vanessa had stared at the child like she'd found a cockroach in her coffee. "Why?" she said slowly, her voice cutting through the room with the precision of a scalpel. "Is there a child in the executive conference room?" Sofia straightened immediately. "I apologize, Ms. Hartwell. My babysitter wasn't available, and I was asked to deliver the—" "I don't want your explanation." Vanessa set her leather portfolio on the table with a sharp crack. "I want to know who authorized the maid to bring her little street child into a professional space." The room went very still. Sofia felt the words land on her like physical blows. Maid, street child, but it was the sound beside her that undid her completely. Because Emma, who had been smiling just a moment ago, had gone very quiet. The little girl was looking up at Vanessa with those enormous brown eyes, and the smile was gone, and in its place was something that no 3-year-old should ever have to wear on her face. Confusion. And the first, fragile edge of hurt. "She's not," Sophia started, her voice cracking despite herself. "She's dirty," Vanessa said flatly, looking at Emma's white dress, which was perfectly clean, with an expression of theatrical revulsion. "And she's touching things. Do you have any idea what a liability that is? One of those small hands knocks over a coffee pot, and we're looking at a lawsuit." "She hasn't touched anything," Sophia said quietly. The words came out steadier than she felt. Vanessa's eyes cut to her like 2 shards of glass. "Did you just interrupt me?" The executives around the table were motionless. Sophia recognized some of their faces, men and women she'd served coffee to every morning for 2 years, people who had said thank you and good morning and occasionally asked about her daughter by name. But right now, not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. The gravity of Vanessa's position in Adrian Cole's life, and therefore in all of their careers, held them frozen in their chairs. Sophia looked down at Emma. Emma was looking up at the big chair at the head of the table. The chair where Vanessa had set her portfolio, but not yet sat. It was a massive thing, deep leather, high-backed, imposing in the way that furniture in rooms like this always is. It was the chair that said power just by existing. Emma tilted her head at it the way toddlers do when they've decided something. Sophia should have seen what was coming. She should have reached down, taken Emma's hand, murmured an apology, and walked quietly out of the room with her daughter and her bruised dignity. But Sophia's heart was breaking, and her hands were shaking, and for just 1/2 second, she was looking at Vanessa's cold, beautiful face instead of her daughter's curious, fearless one. And in that 1/2 second, Emma let go of her mother's fingers and walked toward the chair. Nobody moved. It wasn't the kind of stillness that falls over a room during a boring meeting or an awkward pause. It was the stunned, breathless silence of 12 adults watching something unfold that none of them quite had the vocabulary to describe, something that felt simultaneously absurd and profound, the way that only very small children can make moments feel. Emma crossed the plush carpet in 9 determined steps. She was 3 years old and approximately 32 inches tall. The executive chair at the head of the table was designed for a full-grown adult and stood nearly as high as her shoulders when she reached it. For a moment, she stood in front of it and assessed the problem with the focused intensity of a tiny engineer. Her pigtails were slightly askew. One of her yellow sunflower socks had slipped down around her ankle. She pressed her small palms flat against the leather seat cushion, and then, with extraordinary effort and determination, she began to climb. One knee up, a grunt of exertion, a moment of wobbling, then both knees on the cushion, and then, with a final triumphant push, Emma Reyes turned around, plopped herself down in the chair, and sat. She sat the way that only 3-year-olds and people who have absolutely nothing to prove can sit, completely, unselfconsciously, utterly at home. Her little legs dangled a foot above the floor. Her hands rested on the armrests. She looked out at the room of frozen adults with calm, dark eyes. And then, very softly, she said, "I sit now." 12 executives did not breathe. Vanessa Hartwell had gone a color that her foundation was not designed to conceal. It started at her collarbones and worked its way upward, a deep, mottled red that transformed her from a magazine cover into something far more human and far less composed. Her portfolio sat 6 inches from the child's left hand. Her chair, the chair she had been about to claim, the chair that declared hierarchy and ownership and "do you know who I am?" was currently occupied by a toddler in a sunflower dress. "Remove that child," Vanessa said. Her voice was very quiet, that particular kind of quiet that is more frightening than shouting. Sophia took a step forward. She would take Emma and apologize and leave, and maybe, Maybe she would hold herself together until she got to the stairwell where nobody could see her cry. She was already composing the words in her head. "I'm so sorry, Emma. Come to Mama. I'm so sorry." "Don't." The voice came from the doorway. It was a single syllable, spoken without heat, without urgency, without any of the emotional charge that had been building in the room for the past 4 minutes. It was calm the way that deep water is calm, not because nothing is happening beneath the surface, but because whatever is happening there is far too large and too certain to need the performance of motion. Adrian Cole stood in the doorway. Sophia hadn't heard him arrive. Nobody had. He had the uncanny quality of very powerful people who have spent enough years in rooms like this to know that the ones who make the most noise are usually the ones with the least to say. He was in his work clothes, charcoal pants, a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, no jacket, which told Sophia he'd come from his private office rather than an outside meeting. He was 36 years old, and he had the kind of face that photographs never quite captured correctly, something about the eyes that didn't translate to 2 dimensions. He was looking at Emma. Emma, for her part, was looking back at him with serene curiosity. She had not been startled by his entrance. She was sitting in the large chair with her hands on the armrests and her dangling feet and her one fallen-down sock, and she regarded the tall man in the doorway the way she regarded most things, with frank, open attention and an absence of fear that was either wisdom or innocence, and at 3 years old, there was perhaps no difference. "Adrian." Vanessa's voice shifted registers immediately. The fury redirected, reshaped, smoothed into something that sought alliance. This Maid brought her child into the conference room. "The child is sitting in my... How long has this been going on?" The question was addressed to the room, not to Vanessa. To the 12 executives who had been sitting in silence for the past several minutes, watching a woman humiliate a maid and her daughter, and saying nothing. Nobody answered. Adrian walked into the room. His footsteps were unhurried. He moved past 2 executives without looking at them, past the coffee tray Sophia had arranged, past the window that showed 32 floors of open sky, until he was standing not at the head of the table, but to the side of it, standing, Sophia realized, closest to Emma. "I asked a question," he said, without raising his voice. It was a brief incident. One of the executives, Harrison, the CFO, said carefully. Ms. Hartwell was simply noting that it might be inappropriate to. "I heard what Ms. Hartwell was noting," Adrian said. And something in the way he said it, not angry, not theatrical, just precise, made Harrison stop speaking mid-sentence and sit back. Vanessa lifted her chin. "Adrian, this is completely overblown. I was making a reasonable point about professional boundaries. The maid doesn't belong. Her name is Sophia." Vanessa blinked. "Sophia Reyes," Adrian said. "She's worked in this building for 2 years. She has a perfect conduct record. She's covered 3 additional shifts in the past month without being asked, and she was requested, specifically, to be in this room this morning." He paused. "And her daughter's name is Emma." At the sound of her name, Emma turned her head toward him. Her expression was grave, considering. Then she said, in her small, clear voice, "Hi." And something happened to Adrian Cole's face. It was subtle, the kind of change that most people in the room probably missed because they were watching Vanessa's reaction instead. But Sophia saw it. She was watching him because she didn't know what else to do, because her whole life was suspended in this moment and she didn't know which way it was going to fall. And she saw it, the slight softening around his eyes, the way the line of his jaw loosened by a fraction, the almost imperceptible thing that happened at the corner of his mouth. "Hi," he said back. Emma seemed satisfied with this. She nodded once and returned to surveying her domain. "Adrian." Vanessa's voice had gone cold and precise, the warmth stripped out of it entirely. "I would like this handled. Now." He turned to look at her then. Fully, completely, in the way that he'd been pointedly not looking at her since he walked into the room. "It is being handled," he said quietly. He let that sit for just a moment before he continued. "I want everyone except Sophia to leave this room. We'll reschedule the 10 o'clock. They filed out without a word. 12 executives, each one avoiding eye contact with a different person. Some avoiding Sophia, some avoiding Vanessa, some staring at their portfolios and phones as if the small rectangle of a screen could render them invisible. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who have long understood that the fastest way to survive the storm is to get out of its path. Vanessa did not move. She stood at the side of the conference table, one hand resting on its surface, and she looked at Adrian with an expression that Sophia had never seen on her face before. Not fury, not coldness, but something more complicated. Something that might, in a different light, have looked like a person realizing for the first time that the story they had been telling themselves about themselves might not be entirely accurate. "You're asking me to leave," Vanessa said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm telling you to leave," Adrian said gently. The gentleness was worse than anger would have been, Sophia thought. There was a terrible finality in it, the kind of quiet that comes not from restraint but from completion. Because of this? A gesture, controlled, elegant, devastating in what it reduced Emma to. This. A problem. An inconvenience. A symbol of a point being made. Adrian looked at his fiancée for a long moment. "Because of everything that led to this," he said. Something moved across Vanessa's face. Then it was gone, and the surface was smooth again, and she picked up her portfolio with both hands and held it against her chest like armor. "We'll talk tonight," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "We will." She left without looking at Sophia, without looking at Emma. The door clicked shut behind her with a soft precision that somehow landed harder than a slam would have. And then there were three. Sophia became aware, in the sudden silence, of how hard her own hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the sides of her uniform skirt, willing them still, and looked at the floor and then at her daughter. Emma, still sitting in the chair, now engaged in the careful examination of one of her own shoes, turning her foot from side to side to watch the buckle catch the light. "I'm so sorry," Sophia said. Her voice didn't sound like hers. It sounded like something that had been wrung out and hung up to dry. "I never should have brought her up here. I had no childcare, and I was asked specifically to deliver but that's not your problem, and I know the rules, and I'm so sorry, Mr. Cole. I will absolutely understand if you need to." "Sophia." She stopped. "Stop apologizing." She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't read, not the CEO face, not the face from the photos in the business magazines her former college roommate used to page through. Something quieter than that. Something less constructed. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said. The words hit her somewhere in the sternum, and she had to press her lips together to keep everything she was feeling from spilling out in the middle of his conference room. She was so tired. She was so tired of being strong and steady and fine in the specific way that people who have no backup plan have to be fine, because cracking is not an option when you are the only thing standing between your child and the ground. "Mama." Emma's voice, from the chair. "Down, please." Sophia crossed to her quickly, lifting her with practiced ease, settling the warm small weight against her hip. Emma wrapped her arms around Sophia's neck and put her chin on her mother's shoulder and looked at Adrian from this new vantage point with calm, assessing eyes. Adrian Cole had watched a great number of business negotiations. He had sat across tables from people who wanted things from him and learned early to read the specific texture of human want, the hunger for money, for status, for power, for approval. He had become very good at it. Some people told him it made him cold. He thought it made him accurate. He was not prepared for the way Emma looked at him. She was not assessing his power or his wealth or his position. She was not performing cuteness or bid for approval. She was simply looking at him the way that children look at new people, completely without agenda, deciding with some interior calculus that had nothing to do with resumes or reputations whether he was safe. After a moment, she extended one small hand toward him. In her palm was a button. A small, white, perfectly ordinary button that she had apparently found on the floor sometime in the last several minutes and collected with the acquisitive instinct of all small children for small things. She held it out to him. An offering. Or a test. Or both. Adrian looked at the button. Then he looked at Emma. Something shifted in his chest. Old. Deep. In a place he'd largely stopped checking because there had seemed no point. He reached out and took the button very gently from her palm. "Thank you," he said. Emma studied him for another moment. Then she nodded once, solemnly, and rested her head back on her mother's shoulder. Sophia was watching him. He could feel it, the careful, cautious attention of someone who has learned that kindness from powerful people usually comes with terms and conditions attached. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She hesitated. He pulled out 2 chairs from the conference table, not the power chair at the head, but 2 ordinary chairs near the window, angled toward each other. He sat in one. He waited. After a moment, Sophia sat in the other, Emma still balanced on her hip. Outside, the city hummed 32 floors below. The morning light came through the glass at a low angle, catching the dust motes in the air, making the conference room feel, just briefly, less like a room where power was transacted and more like a room where 2 very tired people sat down next to a window. "Tell me about yourself," Adrian said. Sophia stared at him. "I'm sorry. Tell me about yourself. Not your employee file. I've read that." A pause. "Tell me something that isn't in your file." She was quiet for a moment. Emma had begun a quiet investigation of the collar of Sophia's uniform, tiny fingers tracing the edge of the fabric with sleepy concentration. "I used to teach," Sophia said finally. Her voice was careful, the words chosen slowly, as if she was walking on ice and testing each step. "2nd grade. Before," she stopped. "Before Emma?" "Before Emma's father left." The words were flat, stripped of drama, the way that old pain sometimes goes when you've carried it long enough that it becomes simply part of the weight. "I couldn't afford the apartment on a teacher's salary alone. I couldn't afford childcare on a teacher's salary. So She looked down at Emma. "I made the best choice I could." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "You like teaching," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up. "More than anything." He nodded slowly. And then he turned the small white button over in his fingers, once, twice, and set it carefully on the table. Adrian Cole had built an empire on the principle that information was more valuable than emotion. He had learned this at 19, sitting across from his first investor, a man named George Whitfield who wore the same gray suit every meeting and had a habit of pressing his thumb and forefinger together when he was calculating something, and watching the man dismantle a competitor's pitch not by getting angry, but by knowing more, by seeing more, by understanding that the story beneath the story was the only story that mattered. He had applied this principle to every professional relationship he'd had since. It had made him extraordinarily successful. It had also made him, by most accounts, extraordinarily difficult to know. Vanessa had told him once, early in their relationship, that being with him was like standing outside a very beautiful house and never being invited in. He'd thought about that for a long time afterward. He'd wondered if she was right. He'd wondered if the house even had an inside anymore, or if he'd renovated it so many times in the name of efficiency that he'd accidentally taken out all the load-bearing walls. He thought about that conversation now, sitting across from a maid and her 3-year-old daughter in his conference room, with a small white button on the table between them. He thought about what Vanessa had said when she walked in. "Street child." 2 words spoken without hesitation, without cruelty in any premeditated sense, which was almost worse. The casual cruelty of someone who had never had to think about what those words would land like. He thought about the moment he'd stood in the doorway. He'd been walking past, a coincidence. He'd heard the particular quality of silence that only exists in rooms where something is happening that everyone has agreed not to address, and seen Emma in the chair. He thought about the way the room had looked in that instant. Vanessa, rigid with displeasure. 12 of his most senior executives, frozen in the particular paralysis of people who know something is wrong and have decided that the cost of saying so is too high. And Sophia, small, steady Sophia with her shaking hands and her lifted chin and her daughter balanced on her hip, standing in the middle of all that silence and holding herself together through what appeared to be sheer, exhausted will. And Emma, sitting in the chair, looking at the world as if it were simply and straightforwardly hers to be curious about. Something about that image had done something to him that he was still in the process of understanding. "I owe you an apology," he said. Sophia looked up. "You didn't. Not for today specifically. Though today was—" He paused, choosing the word with care. "Unacceptable. But I mean more broadly." He turned the button in his fingers again. "This building runs on the assumption that the people who make it work, who actually physically make it work every day, are somehow less than the people who sit in the chairs at the top. I've allowed that assumption to stand because addressing it was inconvenient." A beat. That's not a good enough reason. Sophia was watching him with the expression of someone who is deciding very deliberately how much to believe. "You can't fix a culture in a single morning," she said carefully. "No," he agreed. "But you can start." Emma had fallen into that sudden, complete toddler sleep that always seemed to happen without transition, 1 minute fully awake, the next gone entirely, her head heavy and warm on Sophia's shoulder, her breathing deep and even and perfectly trusting. Sophia shifted her slightly, a small automatic adjustment of the kind that looked so practiced it must have been done 10,000 times. Adrian watched this without pretending he wasn't watching. He had thought, not very long ago, that he wanted children someday in the abstract, theoretical way that people who have built extensive emotional walls think about things that require tearing them down. Someday. Eventually. When the business was at a certain benchmark. When his life had a certain shape. Children were a variable that required the right conditions. But watching Sophia hold Emma, the specific competence and tenderness of it, the way she was doing 3 things simultaneously and doing all of them well, the way Emma trusted without reservation or analysis or conditions, the way that he himself hadn't trusted anything for longer than he could clearly remember, he understood suddenly that children do not wait for the right conditions. They arrive in the present tense, demanding everything now, offering everything now, and either you are capable of being present with them or you are not. He thought about Vanessa at Christmas, her insistence that children wouldn't fit their lifestyle, not yet, not with the travel and the social calendar and the renovations and the career trajectory she had mapped for him with the same detailed efficiency she brought to everything. He had agreed. He had thought she was probably right. He had filed it under eventually. He wondered now what he had been agreeing to, exactly. "What happens to Emma while you work?" he asked. Sophia blinked at the directness of the question. "She has a regular sitter. Mrs. Patterson. She lives in my building." A pause. Today was an exception. "Mrs. Patterson has medical appointments on Fridays." Sophia stared. "How did you? Your file mentions that you've requested several last-minute schedule adjustments on Fridays. I wanted to understand why." He said it simply, without apology for having read her that carefully. "I should have made sure there was an accommodation already in place." "That's also on me." Sophia was quiet for a long moment. "You read my file," she said slowly. "I read everyone's file." "No." She shook her head slightly, and something moved through her expression. Not quite a smile, not quite its opposite, something more complicated than either. "Most people like you read the files of people like me to find problems. To find reasons." She looked down at Emma's sleeping face. "You read mine to understand." He didn't answer that. He turned the button over one more time and set it down, and outside the window the city continued its 32 floors below indifference to all of them, and in the conference room the morning light shifted, and everything was very still. "I'm going to need to make some changes," he said finally. Not to her specifically. More to the room, to the morning, to the specific shape of the things he'd been not quite looking at for longer than was honest. "I know," Sophia said softly. And somehow, from her, it sounded less like a judgment and more like something else entirely. Like the first ordinary words of a longer conversation that had not yet really begun. The call with Vanessa happened at 7. Adrian had asked Mrs. Chun, his household manager, to make sure he wasn't interrupted. He sat in his home office. Not the grand one on the first floor that had been photographed for Architectural Digest, but the small one on the third floor where the desk was battered and the bookshelves were honest, and the window looked out over the garden rather than the skyline, and he said the things that needed to be said. Vanessa had come prepared. She had a version of events that was carefully structured and not entirely wrong in its facts, and she delivered it with the cool efficiency of someone who had spent a long time learning to argue. She talked about stress and misunderstandings and the pressures of public life. She talked about how Sophia shouldn't have been there in the first place. She talked about how the situation had been blown completely out of proportion. He listened. He let her finish. Then he said, very quietly, "You called a 3-year-old a street child." Silence. That was rhetorical, Adrian. I didn't literally. You meant her to feel it, he said. Even if you didn't mean to say it out loud. And she did feel it. I watched it happen. More silence. Longer. Is this about the girl? Vanessa asked finally. Or, is this about us? Adrian leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. I think, he said carefully, it's been about us for a long time. I think we've both been building something that looked right from the outside and neglected to check whether it felt right from the inside. A pause. I think I've been unfair to you by not saying this sooner. He heard her breath catch. And then, to her credit, to the credit of whoever Vanessa Hartwell was underneath the architecture she'd built around herself, she didn't argue. I know, she said finally. Her voice had changed. Something human had come back into it. I think I knew it before today. A long pause. I was not kind this morning. I want you to know that I'm aware of that. I know you are. It doesn't excuse it. No. Another silence. But different from the others, softer, sadder, with less armor in it. We'll work out the details, she said. Yes. Adrian. Yes. I hope. She stopped. Started again. I hope whoever she is, whoever you end up being this person for, I hope she sees it. How much you have in there. Most people don't get to see it. He didn't have an answer for that. He sat with it for a moment after the call ended, in the small, honest office with the garden window, and he thought about what she'd said. Most people don't get to see it. He'd always thought that was simply the price of the life he'd built. The cost of the efficiency. He thought about Emma handing him a button. He thought about Sophia saying, "You read mine to understand." He turned the small white button over in his fingers. He'd carried it in his pocket all day without quite knowing why, and looked at it in the lamplight. Downstairs, something was happening. He heard it through the floor, small and distant, but real. A sound he didn't immediately recognize, one that didn't belong to the usual vocabulary of the mansion's evenings. He set the button on his desk and walked out of the office and stood at the top of the stairs and listened. It was singing. A child singing, formless and tuneful in the way of toddlers who don't know all the words and don't let that stop them, pure and unself-conscious and filling the stairwell with the specific acoustic warmth of small, unself-conscious joy. He walked downstairs. In the kitchen, the large one, all marble counters and professional appliances that Mrs. Chen maintained as if it were a temple, Sophia Reyes was loading the dishwasher. She had changed out of her uniform into ordinary clothes, jeans and a green sweater, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked, in the ordinary clothes, like a completely different person, and also, he understood this was the thing, she looked like exactly the same person, just without the costume that said invisible. Emma was on the counter. She had been placed, clearly, in a safe spot on the wide counter, and she was sitting cross-legged among the dish towels, singing to a small rubber duck that must have been produced from some pocket or bag, completely absorbed in the duck and the song and the warm light and her own world. Sophia heard him come in and straightened. I'm sorry, I needed to use the kitchen too. Is that what you're going to do every time? He asked. Apologize. She hesitated. Then slowly she smiled. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it was nothing like the careful professional expressions she'd worn all morning. It was warm and slightly wry, and gone almost as quickly as it came. Old habit, she said. I'd like you to stop. I'll work on it. Emma had noticed him. She looked up from the duck with immediate recognition and no surprise.
Hi again, she said. Hi again, he said.
She held up the duck. Duck, she informed him. I see that. His name Gerald. That's a very good name. She seemed pleased by this assessment and returned to her song. Adrian sat down at the kitchen island. He didn't have a plan for why. He didn't engineer it toward a particular outcome. He simply sat down because the room was warm and the child was singing and Sophia was standing with her hip against the counter watching him with quiet, careful eyes, and because he was tired, not the physical tiredness of a long day, but something older than that, something at the cellular level, the tiredness of a person who has been performing a version of himself for a very long time in a house that has not, until this particular evening, in this particular kitchen, felt anything like home. Can I ask you something?
Sophia said.
Yes. Why did you keep the button? He looked up. She nodded toward his hand. He hadn't realized he'd brought it back downstairs, that he'd picked it up from the desk without thinking and carried it down here with him the way Emma had carried her duck. He looked at the button in his palm for a moment. I'm not entirely sure, he said honestly. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the dishwasher and didn't say anything else. But the silence had a different texture now, easy, unhurried, like something that didn't need to be filled. Emma sang about Gerald the duck. The mansion, which had stood for 11 years around the careful and largely performative life of Adrian Cole, seemed, just slightly, just fractionally, to settle. As if it had been holding a breath for a very long time and had only just now remembered how to let it go. 3 months later. The offer had been extended carefully, professionally, with every appropriate boundary clearly defined and no pressure applied in any direction. Sophia had a written agreement, a salary increase, a defined schedule, and full benefits. She had consulted a lawyer, a real one, not a friend's advice, before signing anything. Adrian had noted with something that lived in the neighborhood of admiration, extraordinarily careful about not letting hope outpace reason. Emma had no such caution. Emma had adopted Adrian Cole with the complete, unceremonious thoroughness that toddlers bring to their affections. She had decided, somewhere around the 4th evening she'd spent in the mansion kitchen while her mother finished late work, somewhere around the 7th time he'd sat on the floor with her and let her show him things she'd found that day. A leaf, an interesting rock, a piece of foil that caught the light, the button, which had become a recurring theme. That he was simply hers. Not a concept to be negotiated. Not a relationship to be defined. Just hers. She called him Ade. Nobody had ever called him that in his life. He hadn't known until she said it, that he'd been waiting for someone to. The morning was a Saturday, which was new. For most of his adult life, Saturday had been an extension of the work week, with fewer scheduled calls. He was relearning what weekends were for, not productivity, not optimization, but the strange, undervalued, necessary work of simply being somewhere with no particular goal. He was in the garden. Emma had informed him, at 6:45 that morning, by appearing at his bedroom door in her pajamas and pressing her face against the gap. He'd started leaving it slightly open, without ever quite deciding to, somewhere around the 5th or 6th week, that there were bugs in the garden and they needed to look at them. Good morning to you too, he'd said. Come on, Ade. No preamble. No negotiation. Just the absolute certainty of a person whose needs are simple and obvious and require immediate attention. So now they were in the garden. Emma was crouched over a patch of dirt near the rose beds, completely absorbed in the investigation of something small and many-legged that had the enormous good luck to cross her path on this particular morning. She was narrating its journey in a continuous, quiet murmur, partly to it and partly to the universe in general. Adrian sat on the garden steps and watched her. He had a cup of coffee. The morning was cool and clean, the light new and unhurried. From the kitchen window above him, he could hear Sophia moving around, the sounds of the morning ritual that had become, gradually, unremarkably, without anyone announcing it, the sounds of his house being lived in. He thought about George Whitfield, his first investor, and the gray suit and the thumb and forefinger habit, and the lesson about information over emotion. He thought about how certain he'd been for so long that this was the correct framework for navigating a life. He turned the button over in his fingers. He'd had it in his pocket every day for 3 months. He hadn't analyzed it. He hadn't decided to keep it. It had simply become one of those things that was just true, like the open bedroom door, like the Saturday morning bugs, like the way the mansion had started making different sounds when it was full. Ade. Emma, without looking up from her bug. Come see. He set his coffee down and walked across the damp grass in his bare feet and crouched beside her. She pointed at the insect with great seriousness. It was a beetle of some ordinary variety, going about its ordinary business. He has a shiny back, Emma said. He does, Adrian agreed. Like your button. He looked at the small face turned up toward his, the wide brown eyes, the serious expression, the grass stain already appearing on the knee of her pajamas that would require Sophia to perform the specific domestic alchemy she applied to Emma's perpetually challenged clothing. A little bit like my button, he said. Emma nodded, satisfied, and returned to the beetle. Behind him, the kitchen door opened. He heard Sophia come out, heard the soft sound of her feet on the stone steps, felt rather than saw her stop a few feet away, coffee in hand, watching. He didn't turn around. He stayed crouched next to Emma in the morning light, looking at an ordinary beetle in the garden of a house that was learning, slowly, what it meant to have people in it who were not performing anything for each other, who were not auditioning for roles or managing perceptions or building structures designed to impress from the outside. She's been up since 6, Sophia said from behind him. 6:45, he corrected. She came to get me at 6:45. A pause. I'm sorry, was she? Sophia.
A beat.
Right, she said quietly. And then, after a moment, old habit. You're working on it. Every day. He heard her sit down on the steps. He heard Emma begin an entirely new narrative about the Beatles' family and the Beatles' house and the Beatles' morning plans. The garden was quiet around them, the city somewhere in the distance, the morning still young enough to belong entirely to itself. Adrian reached into his pocket and took out the small white button. He held it in his palm for a moment. This ordinary thing, this nothing thing, the thing a 3-year-old had found on the floor of a conference room on the morning that everything started to change. And then, without quite deciding to, he smiled. Not the controlled, deliberate expression he'd refined over years of board meetings and negotiations. Not the performative warmth of a man who knew the value of appearing human. Just a smile. Simple and real and belonging completely to the moment in which it existed. Emma looked up from the beetle and saw it. Her face broke open like sunlight. Ade smile, she announced, with the delight of a person reporting an important discovery to anyone who might be listening. Ade smile, Mama. I see that, Sophia said softly. And in her voice, careful Sophia, cautious Sophia, Sophia who tested every step on the ice, there was something new. Something that had been very quiet and very small for a very long time, the way that things that have been kept safe in the dark are small when they first come into light. Something that was, if you listened closely enough, the first shy syllable of joy. Adrian closed his fingers gently around the button. In the garden of a mansion that was learning to breathe, with a beetle and a toddler and a cup of cooling coffee and a woman on the steps behind him who had taught him, simply by holding herself together with shaking hands and refusing to disappear, that the strongest thing in any room is not the person with the most power, but the person with the most heart. He held the beginning of everything in his palm, and it was the size of a button, and it weighed absolutely nothing, and it was the heaviest, truest, most extraordinary thing he had ever held. The end.